Looking at Ezra and Nehemiah, and this is also, we're very definitely coming to the end of the semester, and so today we are starting the last of the 9 historical sections that I gave you guys way back when. So today we are beginning the post-exile, or the post-exilic period, and so this is the period after the exile, the period of the Babylonian exile, when the exiles begin to be allowed to return to Jerusalem and to the surrounding area. And so it's, this area begins to be, Jerusalem begins to be rebuilt, and the area around Jerusalem begins to be resettled. And so that's the theme of this historical section. And Ezra and Nehemiah are like some of the other historical books that we've seen to this point, like 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, that were originally written as one book, but then later split into 2. For the rest of these historical books, the split was because the length of the scrolls got to be so big that the scrolls were impossible to carry safely, and so they cut them off at a certain point, split them into 2 books so that the scrolls would be smaller. Ezra and Nehemiah, though, that's not their history. Ezra and Nehemiah were split much later. In fact, if you look at Ezra and Nehemiah combined are shorter than any of the 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel. So it's not a scroll length problem with them. It was during the history of printing, actually, very early in the history of the printing of the Old Testament. They ended up getting split because somebody thought that they were 2 separate books when they were printing them, and that the tradition stuck. The language changes a little bit at this transition point. Up until Nehemiah, Nehemiah chapter 1, the language tends to be in 3rd person, and then Nehemiah begins with the words of Nehemiah, son of so-and-so, and then it's in 1st person. And so the printer probably thought that because it was switching to 1st person, we're in a different book. And so we have Ezra and Nehemiah. They are one book originally and been divided into 2. And so that's important to know because you're going to be seeing one continuous story through the 2 books. And you'll see themes all the way through the 2 books. And if you think that they are 2 separate books, you'll probably miss these themes. You'll miss the picture that's being drawn for you. So in Ezra and Nehemiah, we don't know who wrote the book for sure. Ezra and Nehemiah have both been suggested as a potential author for the book. Or it could have been anybody else that was a witness to the events. It could have been literally anybody. The book doesn't claim an author. It doesn't say anybody in particular wrote it. And so we don't know who wrote it, but somebody that was a witness to the events described in it. But it's written, within a few years, few decades of the events that it describes, and the contents we see. There's there's 3 groups of exiles that return, and there's kind of a common arc to their story. The narrative or the plot of their story has a kind of common arc to it. And so we have the first wave of exiles returning under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua. Zerubbabel is a descendant of David, and so there's kind of the question, one of the themes or questions throughout the period of the prophets, or the divided kingdom, and then into the exile is, when is this king in David's line, this Messiah, going to come? Now, when is this one going to come? Who will he be? We know it has to be a descendant of David, and there's all the promises in the prophets that God will bring his people back to their land and restore them and give them peace under this ruler. And so when Zerubbabel is this first leader, or one of the leaders of this first group of returnees, this descendant of David, then the question is Zerubbabel the Messiah? Is Zerubbabel going to be the one that comes and brings all of this fulfillment, all these hopes of the prophets? Is this it? What about it? You haven't taken it? You can come sit on the front row and start it. Is this guy it? Is this the Messiah? And then we have Joshua also. Joshua is in the line of the priests. And so he's descended from the priests. It's definitely not the Joshua that follows Moses, that's Moses' successor. Somebody else that is bearing his name. And so we have this Joshua, the priest, who becomes the first high priest of the reconstructed temple. And so we have this Joshua as the priest, and we have Zerubbabel and Joshua that lead this first wave of returnees. And their primary job, they're coming back to do, is to rebuild the temple and to start up the sacrifices to God again, to begin Jewish worship again. And then after Zerubbabel and Joshua, their work is well underway. Ezra is sent back, and Ezra comes back, and his job is to teach the people. Ezra is also a priest, and his job is to teach the people how to worship God rightly. And he's sent back, as Zerubbabel and Joshua are, and as Nehemiah will be, as we'll see in a minute. He's being sent back by one of the Persian kings and given this job, given this function, this purpose. And his job is to teach the people how to rightly worship God and how to follow the law, so that the God of heaven, the God of the Jewish people, as the Persian king sees it, the God of this region will be pleased with the Persians, with the Persian Empire, and with the king and his family, and will bless them instead of cursing them. And so this is a major push or major move that these Persian kings do that was very different from what the Babylonians and Assyrians did before them. They wanted the captive peoples under them to continue their worship, so that the gods of those regions would be pleased with the Persians and bless them instead of cursing them. This was how they were going to maintain their power and might over time. And so they send back, the king sends back Ezra to educate the people, to make sure that they know how to follow God rightly. And then Nehemiah is cupbearer to the next king, or a later king, and under this later king, Nehemiah is sent back to rebuild the rest of the city, especially the walls around the city, to make it a fortified city again, a defensible fortified city. And so that's your three major leaders and the three major waves of exiles that return. The first under Zerubbabel and Joshua to rebuild the temple. The second under Ezra with the primary goal of rebuilding, or of educating the people so that God is worshipped rightly in the land. And then Nehemiah sent back with commands to rebuild the wall. And we'll also see for each of their stories, for each of their the basic shape of their stories, we'll see first that there is provision from the king, that the empire provides for them to return and gives them what they need to accomplish the task. And so there will be a kind of a lengthy letter, usually from the king, promising all of these things, promising all this provision for them. And then there will be a combination of opposition and corruption, opposition from the outside, people outside of the Jewish camp opposing whatever they're supposed to be doing, whether it's rebuilding or teaching, and then corruption from within. There'll be some kind of failure of the Jewish people within that the leaders have to deal with one way or another. And we'll see this kind of thing over and over again. And you'll have first provision from the king, and then the leader will come back to do the work, and then there will be some combination of opposition and corruption that confounds the work or takes the leader's attention. And then by the end of, the questions, I've already pointed to one of the big questions, but the kind of the big questions that are being asked in this book, or these two books together, originally one book, is God going to keep all the promises that were made at this point? And as we talked a little bit about when we were going through David's life, when we got into 2 Samuel, we talked about David at one point wanted to build a temple for God. He saw that he was living in this magnificent palace after it had been completed, and that the Ark of God was still dwelling in a tent, and that disparity just did not seem right to David, and so he wanted to build a temple, build a house for God. And God replies to David and tells him, no, you aren't going to build me a house, I'm going to build you a house. And in that promise, that offer, that when God tells David, I will build you a house, he makes several promises, among them that God will establish David in the land and give him and his descendants peace there, and that they will be able to remain in the land, that one of David's descendants will always be, that a descendant of David's line will always be on the throne of Israel, and that God will establish one of David's descendants to reign over a kingdom that will never end. And so that those were big promises that were made to David, and then the exile happens. Right? The people will get carried off. And so then the big question for the latter half of the Old Testament, the biggest theological problem or theological question in the latter half of the Old Testament is God going to keep these promises? God has made these promises, and it certainly doesn't look like the people are living in the land in peace after they've been carried off into exile. There's not a king of David on the throne, or a son of David on the throne in Israel, and there definitely doesn't seem to be a kingdom that will last forever and ever, that they've been carried off into exile. And so is God going to keep those promises? And so the prophets will pick up that question, and a lot of what the prophets have to say is reassurances and promises that God is not going to abandon those promises. That what is happening in the exile is a result of the people's sin, but God will keep those promises. And then there are additional promises that are added to those. The prophets promise additional things. That God gives them messages to promise additional things, like that not only will there be a descendant of David on the throne, but that at some point all the nations, not just the Israelites, but all the nations will come back. That all nations will come to Jerusalem to seek God, to seek their God, to seek wisdom from God and wisdom from their leaders. And so the time will come, the day will come when they will, all nations will come to Jerusalem seeking Israel's God. And not only that, but God is not just going to bring the people back and restore the nation, but is going to change them. So that in Ezekiel, with the taking away their hearts of stone and giving them a heart of flesh. So that promise that God is not just going to bring the people back in their current state, but change them, transform them, so that they are able to be God's people, able to follow God's law. And so the question when we come to Ezra and Nehemiah, here we have the very beginning, we have Zerubbabel, son of David, descendant of David, coming back to rebuild the city and rebuild the temple. Is this it? Is God beginning to fulfill all of the promises of the prophets? That's the big question in Ezra and Nehemiah, and we're going to find out as we go. You'll see. And so the first thing we see is in Ezra chapter 1, we get a command from King Cyrus of Persia. And Cyrus issues a decree that all of the captive peoples, all the captured peoples, should return to their own lands if they wish. That any who wish among all these peoples can return to their own lands and reestablish their home cities. But there seems to be kind of a special decree for the people of Judah that they can return and rebuild their place of worship, and it will all be paid for by the kingdom. That basically Cyrus is going to pay for the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And we're told, the very first thing we're told is that this is in order to fulfill the words given through the prophet Jeremiah. And so we're being told, like right at the beginning, that we're starting to see some of the fulfillment of the words of the prophets. And that this is even why Cyrus is doing this, in order to fulfill those words. And so he appoints or selects a number of different people from Judah, descendants of the Jewish people, and kind of principal among them are Zerubbabel and Joshua, the king, the descendant of King David, and the priest, the descendant of the priests. And they come back along with a number of others in order to begin the reconstruction of the temple. And all of it is everything that is necessary. They can draw on the treasury of the kingdom of Persia in order to accomplish. And so much, and also one thing that you're going to see in Ezra and Nehemiah is there's a whole lot of lists. There's a lot of accounting and lists of things and people in order to maintain these records. They recorded these records extensively to maintain the genealogies and the records of who came back and who they were descended from, and how the priestly line was being maintained, and how the line of King David was being maintained, and all these things. So there's a lot of lists. And our first list is we're told that along with all of the provision from the treasury of King Cyrus, he also goes back and opens the vaults and brings out all of the treasures that were stolen out of the temple in Jerusalem when it was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. And so he brings out all of the gold and silver articles from the temple of the Lord and gives them back to these leaders of these exiles to be taken and used in the temple when it's rebuilt. And we're given an inventory of these gold and silver articles, this list at the end of chapter 1. And I'm told that there are 5,400 articles of gold and silver total, and given a breakdown of the basic kind of categories of each one, how many gold dishes and silver pans and gold bowls and matching silver bowls and other articles there were in this trove. And so all of these various articles are given back to be carried and brought back to Jerusalem to be used in the temple once the temple is rebuilt. And so Zerubbabel and Joshua and others begin to load up to head back to Jerusalem, and joining them is another long list of various exiles of all these various families. And so we're given a list of all these various families and the number of people from each family that come back. And at the very end of it, we are told that it is a total of about 42,000 exiles. 42,360 is the final total. And then a bunch of servants and slaves that these Jewish families have acquired during their time of exile. And so they come back to Jerusalem, and when they get to Jerusalem, they begin the work of rebuilding the temple. The first thing they do is they rebuild the altar. Before they've built the rest of the temple, they build the altar so that they can immediately begin sacrifices. And that's kind of a questionable way to go about it. They weren't given any direction from God to do that, but they want to start sacrifices as soon as possible. And so they build the altar and start sacrifices before they start building anything else about the temple. And so they, after they build and dedicate the altar and begin making sacrifices, then they begin work on the rest of the temple complex. And so they are working on all this stuff. They're building all this stuff. They're building the walls of the various courtyards, and they're building the foundations. They're doing all this stuff to get ready to rebuild the temple. And then they start facing opposition. Some of the governors of the regions surrounding them, the other areas around where they are working, start to oppose them, start to murmur against them. And they start to tell them things, they start trying to stop them. And eventually it culminates in them writing a letter back to the new king. And so they write a letter back to the new king, King Artaxerxes. Cyrus has died and passed on at this point, and so Artaxerxes is now in control. And he didn't give the decree of Cyrus. He doesn't know apparently what was said by Cyrus. And so when he receives this letter, he does what they ask. And what they ask in the letter, they tell about this city being rebuilt, this Jerusalem being rebuilt, and they tell about its long history of rebellion against kings, and that they have a long history of turning against the king that is over them, and not paying tributes and taxes as they're supposed to. And so they ask the king to go and order for a search of the records to prove that Jerusalem has been this rebellious city, and that if he allows the city to continue to be built and to be finished out, then the whole region will end up being in rebellion against him. And so Artaxerxes receives the letter, he orders for a search of the archives, and he finds a whole lot of references to the rebellion of Jerusalem against the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians, that all kind of in the last part of our the 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles sections. And so he becomes worried that Jerusalem is indeed a rebellious city, and if they get to finish their buildings and finish all their construction, then they are going to be a major issue. And so he gives an order that they stop work and sends it back, and tells these governors that have written the letter in the first place opposing it that they should go and stop the work by force if necessary. And so they go and they break in and forcibly stop the work. And so the work on the temple stops for a long time, very, very much partially built. They get the foundation in, and the altar is there, and they can make sacrifices on the altar, but the rest of the temple is extremely unfinished. And it takes years before they're able to re-begin again. And eventually, Artaxerxes dies, and then King Darius takes the throne. And early on in the reign of King Darius, God sends prophets to Israel, specifically Haggai and Zechariah, who are prophets in this post-exilic period. And he sends these prophets to encourage and correct or confront the people for their failure to complete the temple. And so the people begin rebuilding the temple again. They continue work on the temple even though they've been told to stop by the king. And so it's not long before some of these governors get wind of what's going on, and so they come and see it, and then they write another letter back to the new king, King Darius this time, telling them that they're working, and they had asked for the names of those who were leading the people and leading in this work so that they could report it to the king so that the king could punish them or kill them. And so they write this letter and say, we asked for their names, and they told us their names, and then they also told us that that King Cyrus had given them permission to build this temple and to rebuild it, even out of the kingdom's coffers, that the kingdom would pay for it. And here's what they're claiming. And so the undercurrent there is, we think you ought to stop this building and punish them. And so King Darius orders that a search be made of the records to see if this decree of Cyrus that they claim actually happened, and he finds the decree of Cyrus that it actually had happened, that Cyrus had actually given them permission and had promised to build the temple back out of the kingdom's treasury. And so he sends back a letter saying that, I haven't found the decree of Cyrus. They have been told to rebuild this temple in order to make sure that sacrifices made to the God of heaven and that the God of heaven will be pleased with us. And so stay away from them and let them finish their work. Let them finish building this temple. And not only that, but we are to pay for the construction of the temple, whatever is necessary, out of the kingdom's coffers. And so the funds will be taken out of the proceeds of the Trans-Euphrates region, which basically means I like this is humorous to me. The governors that complained about the building now have to pay for it out of their own money. They have to pay for it out of their budget. So, that was fun. And so Darius orders the construction be allowed, that it continue, that these other governors not oppose it, and in fact, they have to provide the funds for it. And eventually, it is completed. The temple ends up being finished, and they have this big celebration, this big dedication ceremony when the temple is completed and the full rites and rituals can be conducted, more than just the sacrifices on the altar. But what is jarring about this completion of the temple and the celebration that comes from it is that there are some older folks that either remember the original temple as young children, or remember the stories that their parents told them about the original temple. And when they see the finished temple, the second temple, they are incredibly disappointed. And it falls way short of what they imagined it would be. And so there is as much wailing and mourning and weeping in this dedication ceremony as there is shouting for joy. And the text describes it as the two sounds of joy and of mourning or weeping are so intermingled that they can't tell the difference between the two. They can't tell the difference between one and the other. And everybody can hear this loud noise, even well outside the city they can hear the noise, but they can't tell which sound is which one is louder than the other. And so there's this story, or this thing that happens that begins with a whole lot of hope, but then ends in a lot of disappointment. And so we're going to see that a lot. Hope, lots of hope early on, and then kind of collapses and ends in disappointment. And so that's Zerubbabel and Joshua's story, and then we have Ezra's story. In the last 4 chapters of Ezra, Ezra is sent back to Jerusalem by King Artaxerxes, and so we jump kind of back in time a little bit. We're back to before Darius, and Artaxerxes tells Ezra to get his stuff together and go back with as many exiles as he wants to take, and bring some other articles for the temple in Jerusalem, and bring it back and instruct the people, teach them how to worship rightly, so that the God of heaven, the God of the Jews, will bless the Persians rather than cursing them. And so Ezra takes a group of people and leads them back. And they're told, not only is Ezra told that to take these extra articles, but he's also promised provision. He's given a letter from Artaxerxes to require the other governors in the region to provide all the things that are necessary for the daily functioning of the temple, like all of the animals for the sacrifice, and up to a certain amount of silver worth of animals, and then olive oil and various other things that are required for the functioning in the temple. And then he also exempts all of the workers in the temple from taxes. So priests and Levites and doorkeepers and musicians in the temple don't have to pay taxes. And so all of this is provided, and then Ezra sets off with his group of exiles to return. And Ezra's group of exiles returning seems to be mostly descendants of the priesthood and the Levites, so those that would function or work in the temple. And they come and they get back with this large group of exiles that are returning, but then they get there and there is this problem. When they get there, they realize that a big group of these priests can't prove that they're descended from the priesthood. Their family records have been lost, and so they can't prove their descent from the line of priests, and so they can't serve as priests. And so there's a large number of this group that returns, claiming that are priests, that are descended from the priesthood, but they can't prove it by their family records, and so they are declared unclean and can't function as priests. And so they have this problem, this kind of opposition, but it's not an external opposition, except in the fact that these family records have been lost or suppressed somewhere along the way, and so now this group can't function as priests. And then within as they are teaching and educating, making sure that people know how to rightly worship God, and making sure that the temple sacrifices and offerings are done appropriately, Ezra realizes or learns that there is a problem with a lot of the exiles who returned being involved in these marriages that are not according to the law, because a lot of the men in exile have married women of these other tribes, the tribes that they were forbidden to marry, the various Canaanite tribes mostly. And so a lot of these men have married these women from these other tribes, and now they've come back, and there's this group of men married to these women of these other tribes, and some of them are having children with them. And when Ezra sees that, he is deeply disturbed. Now, I want to point out in this section, because the outcome is disturbing if you think it out at all. There's no point in this where God tells Ezra to do anything. God never tells Ezra what to do or how to solve this situation. So keep that in mind. What happens is not a decree of God. It is a group of human beings trying to figure out their own plan for how to solve a tension with the law. And so Ezra has he tears his robe. He has this kind of big heartbreak moment when he realizes, grieves how the Jewish exiles have broken the law and intermarried with these women and had children with them. And then he lays weeping for most of the day. And then at the evening sacrifice, he gets up and he goes and he confronts the leaders, confronts all of the leaders of the tribes that have intermarried with all of these foreign women. And they end up being very disturbed, because they think that because they have broken the law this way, that many other people have broken the law this way, that God is going to be angry with them and destroy them, send them back into exile. And so they decide, or Ezra suggests, and then the rest of the leaders go along with the plan, they decide that the thing to do is to have all of these men divorce these women and send them and their children away. And so basically to put these women from other tribes and all the children had by them out of the city, out of the nation, send them away, and not have anything to do with them anymore. And eventually, that's what most of the nation does. Most of the Jewish exiles who return, that's what they do. They make commitments to do this. And a lot of what we see in chapter 10 is them trying to work out how to do this, and then a list of those who had done this thing, that had committed this sin, or that were guilty of intermarrying with these other tribes. And again, it's important to note that God never commands them to do this. God doesn't tell these men, or this group of men, to abandon their wives and children and send them away. And in fact, if you look back further in the Old Testament story, there's a very prominent example of a man that marries a woman from a foreign tribe, and not only is that union accepted, but it's blessed pretty thoroughly. Ruth, there's a whole book dedicated to it. It's short, it's four chapters, it's a short book, but it's a whole book dedicated to this situation where Ruth, the Moabitess, marries Boaz, a righteous man from Bethlehem, and their son ends up being the grandfather of King David. And so Ruth the Moabitess is the great-grandmother of the greatest king of Israel. And then the great-great-grandmother of the king that actually builds the temple. And so there's this union that is blessed because Ruth the Moabitess shows compassion and love to her mother-in-law and learns to live as a Jewish woman. She basically adopts Judaism, becomes Jewish over the course of her experiences, and so her union with Boaz is accepted. And there's some other stuff in there too about why that's accepted, and levirate marriage is involved. We talked about that back in the day, but that union is accepted because Ruth learns to be Jewish and practice Judaism. And we have Ezra, who has been sent to teach the people, and yet instead of teaching this group, he sends them away. And so my conclusion in this, and a lot of people's conclusion, a lot of scholars' conclusion in this, is that this was not God's intention that they send them away. This was a bad reaction to the internal corruption, and will leave us with one of these questions over here, an answer to it. And so that ends Ezra's story, and so then we roll over and we're in the book of Nehemiah, which is, again, just the latter part of Ezra Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king of Persia. And so he's cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. And he is, if you don't remember what a cupbearer is from way back when we were looking at Genesis, and the story of Joseph, when the cupbearer and baker are thrown in with him and he interprets their dreams and it all comes to pass. We talked about then what a cupbearer is. But a cupbearer's job was to bring beverages to the king and to make sure that the king and his household had wine and other drinks, other beverages. And so his job was to make sure that there was enough wine and that it was really good wine, and that the people would that the king was satisfied with it, and to make sure that it was never poisoned. And so often the cupbearer would drink some of the wine before the king did, and if the cupbearer didn't die, then the king would note that it wasn't poisoned and that it was okay. So the cupbearer was somebody that had a lot of access to the king, because he was going to be bringing wine to him and to his family, or to his table, multiple times a day. And he was important in the sense that he was somebody that you didn't want to be easily bribed into poisoning the king, because it would be pretty easy for him to do. And so they were significant. It was an important position, but it wasn't a very influential position. They didn't have control over provinces or the lives of a lot of people. It was a service position, but a very important one, and one that gave you a lot of access to the king. And so Nehemiah is a cupbearer, and so he is doing his job, being cupbearer to the king. And one day, one of the exiles that had gone to Jerusalem comes back to the capital city on some errand or business, and sees Nehemiah, and Nehemiah asks him about how things are going in Jerusalem, and he hears about how things are going there, that the temple has been rebuilt, but the walls around the city, or the walls around the city, haven't been rebuilt. Things aren't right, and the rest of the city lies largely in rubble. And so there's all these problems, and the city has not been restored at all to its former glory. And when Nehemiah hears about how bad things are still in Jerusalem, he's torn up about it, and his apparently normally jovial or happy countenance is changed. And so his normally good mood crashes. And so when he goes in to serve the king, the next time he goes in, the king notices that he's in a bad mood, that things are not going well for him. And so he asks him, what's got you so downcast? What's messing with you? Why are you sad? And Nehemiah realizes that he's got this opportunity. The king has asked him this question, has broached the subject, and he's got an opportunity to maybe do something about it because of his access to the king. And so he quickly prays and asks God to bless this conversation that's about to happen, to give him success. And so then he explains to the king what has happened, what he has heard about his people's city, that it still lies in ruins. And then he asks for permission to go and to take some exiles with him and to rebuild the wall around the city, and to he even boldly asks the king for the materials to do it, for wood and stone and finances to finance the project to rebuild the walls around the city. And the king is so pleased with Nehemiah in general that he gives him permission and basically appoints Nehemiah as governor over the region, and sends him with letters demanding that woodcutters and stonecutters in the area provide whatever is needed for this reconstruction of the wall, and sends him with money and letters to be able to draw more money to complete the project. And so Nehemiah sets off with another group of exiles, and they come back and they get there, and immediately after Nehemiah arrives, he doesn't tell anybody why he's there. It'd be kind of an obvious thing that he was arriving with a large entourage, and so they knew he was there, but they didn't know why he was there. And so he takes this tour and sees how things actually stand, and then the next day he gets up and shows everybody the letters that he has been given and tells everybody what the plans are, and the people of the city are enthusiastically behind the rebuilding of the wall. And so they start the work, and he breaks it down so that there are a couple dozen different sections of the wall that are being overseen by different people, and they tend to be the various sections are overseen by some influential person that lives right next to that section of the wall, which gives them an incentive to make sure that the walls are well built, so that they don't ever fall down on their house, or that if enemies come attacking, that it's not there that they're going to come through. And so we've got all these different sections. There's a long list in Nehemiah chapter 3 of all these different builders that are responsible for rebuilding these different sections of the wall. And we're told that some of them have these various occupations. Like I think probably the best one, and makes you scratch your head and wonder why did he get this position, is the perfume maker. There's a guy who's a perfume maker, and he's got a contractor, or the foreman over this section of the wall being rebuilt. But they begin this building of the wall, and it's not long. They're making really fast, really good progress, but it's not long before opposition comes. And there are several people in the area, leaders of other cities in the area, that get real nervous seeing this walled city get built up real quick right in their presence, right around them. And so they start trying to do these kind of underhanded things to stop the building of the wall. And so he starts to mock them, make fun of them, try to discourage them. One of them does anyway, and they build it, and it comes up to the point they get it to about half the height it's supposed to be. And these other governors realize that making fun of them and shouting curses at them is not going to discourage them. They got to take a more direct approach, and so they start bringing armed men around and kind of traipsing around the outskirts, basically with this threat that we're going to come and attack. And they send in these various letters threatening to attack if they continue to rebuild the wall. And then later, some of these letters start to be promises to falsely accuse the Israelites of intending to rebel against the king to stop the construction. But once the physical intimidation tactics start, instead of stopping work on the wall, Nehemiah just gives orders to change how the work is being done. Instead of people sleeping all around the outskirts of the city, he says everybody now sleeps inside of the walls that we have built, and everybody keeps on their armor at all times. So all the men keep on their armor all the time, and the workers all have to wear a weapon. They all have to keep a weapon on them. And half of the workers serve as guards during the day, and the other half do the work. And then those who are assigned to carry materials among the workers are to do the work with a sword in one hand, a bared sword in one hand, and the materials they're carrying to the job site in the other. This is going to slow down the work, but they're all real ready for a fight. And when these intimidators, these people that are opposed to the work, see the level of readiness for a fight in the city, they stop trying to do the intimidation thing and go with the threaten to lie about them. And the threaten to lie about them thing is to get Nehemiah to come out of the city to talk to them so that they can kill him when he doesn't have this big group of ready to fight Jewish men around him. That also fails. And eventually they're able to complete the building of the wall. In fact, they do it incredibly quickly. The entire wall around the city of Jerusalem is built in a little less than 2 months. And if you consider that this is large stones and big timbers being used to build this wall, all the way around a good-sized city, and it's done in less than 2 months without heavy equipment. I mean, it's a very impressive project. They get it done very quickly, especially with all the threats against them. But then in the midst of all of this building, Nehemiah sees a problem among the people in Jerusalem, among the Jewish people, a corruption amongst them. There are a lot of wealth disparities between them, and a lot of that wealth disparity is because the richest members of the community and the leaders of the community are using practices that are against the law that disadvantage the poor. So, for example, one of the laws given through Moses was that a Jewish person was not to loan to another Jewish person at interest. And so you could give a loan to a fellow Jew, but it wasn't allowed to be for profit. You couldn't make profit off of it. You couldn't charge interest. And so you could give a loan, but it was more in the form of giving them a gift that they had to repay. You couldn't make money off of it. And that's not what they were doing. They were charging interest, and not only some interest, but a lot of interest that would make it really difficult for the poor to get out of debt. When you have interest and the interest keeps the amount that you have to repay going up and up and up, eventually, you just can't get out of debt. And then also there were some that would, especially because of the debt, the ever-increasing debt, they would sell themselves as slaves to some of these leaders. And the law required that after a period of 7 years, you had to let these slaves go. You couldn't keep a slave against their will after 7 years. And in order to get around that aspect of the law, they would sell these their fellow Jews, these slaves, to someone else, to someone that wasn't Jewish, and so who didn't have to obey the law. And so they would make a quick buck off of them before selling them into lifelong slavery. And this was illegal. This was against the law. That you are not allowed under Jewish law. If you have a Jewish slave, you are not allowed to sell them to a non-Jewish person, because the non-Jewish person, the foreigner, would not observe the law and the protections for slaves given in the law. They wouldn't release them after 7 years, for example, or require certain levels of treatment for slaves. And so they're doing these things to get around the law and to profit themselves. And so Nehemiah confronts them, and this is actually a really hopeful, really good scene. This is a kind of unusual moment in human history, not just in Jewish history, but an unusual moment in human history, where the wealthy, the rich, were confronted, and they saw the problem, and they repented, and they did what they could to fix it. And so they stopped charging interest on the loans to the poor. They stopped selling any of those that had already sold themselves into slavery as slaves and began releasing them. And then they took the money that they had made off of these loans at interest and the selling of these slaves to others over time, and they started using that money to buy back slaves that had been sold to foreigners that weren't keeping the law towards these Jewish slaves. And so they start buying these slaves and bringing them back out of captivity and out of slavery back into Israel, and then obeying the law towards them and releasing them when their service was up. And so it was like for the first time, or one of a very few times in human history, that the wealthy actually voluntarily give up their wealth because they're confronted with the moral problem. They voluntarily give up their wealth and start acting in a way that's more egalitarian. And so, that's a hopeful sign. And then the wall is completed, and that kind of ends this first chunk of Nehemiah and the main story of Nehemiah's purpose in coming. But Nehemiah is the governor of the region, and so there's more that he's going to do. And starting in chapter 8, Nehemiah is going to work with Ezra, and they're going to try to bring about a spiritual and religious revival in Jerusalem and among the Jewish exiles that have returned. And so they find a copy of the law in the temple, the book of Moses, and they bring it out and they read it to the people. And not only do they read it out loud in the temple or among the people, they gather all the people together and they read it out loud, and they have priests and scribes standing all throughout the crowd. And as they're reading the law out loud from morning until evening, from dawn until sunset, these priests and scribes standing among the people will turn and explain it to anybody that doesn't seem to be understanding it. So they're giving the interpretation to the people along with the reading so that everybody understands it. And the immediate result of this is that after just a little while, the people start wailing and mourning because they realize that they haven't been following the law. They haven't been doing what it requires of them. And so they start weeping and wailing and grieving the fact that they have failed to keep the law until Ezra and Nehemiah stop the reading. And they tell everybody, this is not a day for mourning. We have recovered the scriptures, recovered the law of God. This is a day for celebration and feasting. And so they tell them to go and to kill animals, and prepare them and have feasts, and to make sure to send portions of your animal to anybody that can't afford one of their own, to make sure that everybody is getting to feast on this day. And not only do they do it this day, they do it for the next 6 days. And so there's a full 7 days of scripture reading from sun up until sundown and feasting around this reading of the scriptures. And then they celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles, which was a festival that was required way back in Leviticus. And it required the people to go out and build temporary shelters or tents for themselves outdoors. And the whole point, the purpose, was to remind them of how the people had lived during the Exodus, to remind them what God had done in bringing them out of slavery in Egypt and bringing them to the Promised Land, to remember that their families, their ancestors, had lived as wanderers in the desert for this period, and God had taken care of them. And so they celebrate this festival that had been neglected for a long time. And so we end with that story stops with this really happy note. Things are looking up. But then Nehemiah gets called back to the capital city of Persia on business because he is the Persian governor of this region. And so he's sent back on business, and he's gone for a couple of years, and then he comes back, and the book closes with his observations about what he sees. And so he sees, one thing that he sees, first of all, the first group of exiles, they were coming back to rebuild the temple, right? The first thing that he notices is that the temple has fallen into neglect, that the people aren't maintaining it, they aren't taking care of it properly, and worship isn't being done as it should be there. And so, it's only been a few years, but the temple is already falling into disrepair and not being taken care of properly. And then Ezra, his command of his big thing was to teach the people, and he specifically confronted them over the intermarriage. And when Nehemiah comes back, he finds that the people are back to these intermarriages. They're doing these marriages, they're marrying these women outside of the tribes, even though they've been confronted with it and told to stop that. And then Nehemiah's big job was the wall. And he comes back and he finds that this marketplace has been built in underneath the wall, and they're buying and selling and working on the Sabbath day in this market underneath the wall. And so all three of these phases of the reconstruction and the restoration, Nehemiah comes back after just a relatively short absence and finds that it's all being corrupted and all being misused. And so the very last thing in the book is Nehemiah going around to some of these Jewish men that are doing these things, are violating these practices, and beating them and grabbing them by their beard and jerking out their beard hairs and forcing them to swear an oath to obey the law and to do what God said. And then it ends with a prayer from Nehemiah basically saying, God, you saw how hard I tried. I tried. And then that's where the book ends. Again, whole lot of hope that ends in disappointment. And so then you come back to these questions. Is God going to fulfill the Davidic covenant? Is this when the Messiah is going to come? And all of that promise to David about the permanent peace in the land and all that's going to be fulfilled? Well, Zerubbabel was a descendant of David, but he's never crowned king. And people never get the land back fully. They don't get to rule over themselves. Is this going to be when the hope of the nations will come and all the nations will flock to Jerusalem to seek wisdom and to seek God? Well, no. How many times during the story did we see people of the other nations being sent away, especially under Ezra, when all of the wives and children from these other tribes are sent away instead of being taught the ways of God and brought into the family, brought into the Jewish people? And then finally, is this when the new hearts are going to be given, the people's heart of stone taken away and new hearts given so that they can obey the law? Well, Nehemiah comes back and all the work of Ezra and Nehemiah is being neglected and corrupted already. And so, no, this is not it. And so you get to the end of Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's like this hope that this would be it. This would be the beginning of it. But obviously it's not. This isn't it. And so something is coming. Something has to come later to fulfill these things. And so then the question is, what? And that's kind of the end of that storyline in the Old Testament. And you have to wait for the New Testament for an answer. That's it. And we're over time. I'm sorry about